So what Deluge is, if you're not already familiar with, is basically our own programming language that lets you write logic and automated actions across multiple Zoho applications. So we can only have point-and-click configurations and workflows that do so much, but after a certain point, if we want something to be very complex and do something completely unique, kind of like our creator apps in the morning, we're going to need a custom workflow builder. And that's kind of like Deluge. And so a lot of people think Deluge is, hardcore programming language, maybe like a Python or a Java. I would really equate it a little bit more to Excel equations and macros. So if you're pretty familiar with Excel, you can do, equal sum and calculate something in Excel. You shouldn't be too scared about this. So Deluge stands for the Data Enriched Language for the Universal Grid Environment. There's two main parts of Deluge. So one is going to be the applications that can trigger Deluge functions. So this is a list of all the apps that can trigger custom functions. And so some of them are stars because they're still like kind of in private release stages and not for GA. But for the most part, we've got about, I think, 24-ish different apps right now that support them. But we have 40 apps in Zoho, so we still have a long way to go. But basically, this means that when an action happens in one of these applications, it should be able to trigger a custom function written in Deluge that does some workflow action for us. And then when it comes to workflow actions, I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in the session. But just know that these are the trigger points from different applications. And I'll try to use an example or two here to connect them. The next piece is going to be when you're using a Deluge function, there's a couple different ways, or I would say logic that's happening in there. Generally, you're going to be manipulating data in some way, shape, or form. And you probably want to either create a record somewhere, update a record somewhere, delete a record somewhere, and make changes to data that exists in other Zoho applications. And so these are about the 24 applications that you can access data in Deluge directly without having to make any API calls or anything. So I'm not going to go into API calls during this session because that might be a little bit too advanced, but just know that you can easily access data across all 24 of these apps inside of a Deluge function and be able to search for records, update records, create records, and make changes to data that exists in those apps within a function itself. This is where it gets very basic. So the very basics of scripting or programming in general, the first thing you start with is something called variables, right? So variables are going to be a piece of information that can hold different values. And so here we've got a glass, and we've got 4 different glasses technically, and each one of these glasses have 3 different things in there. One's empty, the first one, then we got lemonade, root beer, and milk, right? And so if we look at this glass and the contents of the glass, all 3 are a little bit different components of the same thing. First things first is the glass is the container itself. You can put anything in this glass. You could put water, you can put milk, you can put juice, soda, a beer, whatever, right? And then in the contents is, the stuff you're putting inside of it. And last is what you're actually naming it. It can be my favorite mug, it could be, Cowboys game cup, it could be milk glass, it could be Santa's cup, whatever you want to call it. It's just a name for what the container is and the contents of it, so it's easily identifiable in the future. And in less cool terms and less picturesque, these are like real, I would say, variables and data types that you experience when you're working with data in Zoho applications. And so most of you probably should know all of these, maybe not the exact naming scheme of them. But the first one is string, and this is the most common. This is just a text of information, generally words and letters, but it could have numbers in there, it could have special characters, and it's just pieces of information that's bound together. So a decimal is 2.1. Obviously, they're just the important part here between the second and third rows is that there's a difference when you put a point after something, right? Because a number is basically a whole number, if we go back to like elementary math, and a decimal is something that can hold partial values in there, where a whole number can't. It's kind of like a rounding situation, if you will. Then you have dates. Everyone should know dates. And then a decision, which is a little bit weirder, but it's kind of more like a binary value. It's either true or false. I'll go through a couple examples of these, I guess. So the important thing is when you're using these different variables and data types, when you're writing a script, it does exactly what you want it to say, or what you make it say. And so like we had before with the glass and the cup example with the milk and stuff like that, the way we write different statements is something on the left equals something on the right, and then we add a semicolon at the end. So the semicolon is kind of like our period of that statement. It's how we have a full stop, and that's how we know that the operation that was supposed to be completed on that line has completed, and we need to go on to the next step. So if you're looking at it from like a numbered list perspective, the period or the semicolon at the end indicates go on to the next line. So there's no like overlap or running values. So what I mean by that is if I have a line of text and it says my name equals Tejas here, I can simply say my name is going to be the variable on the left-hand side, and Tejas is the value on the right-hand side. And I put a period or a semicolon at the far end of it. So a couple more examples, you can see that the way these are written is a little bit different based on the data type of the variable, right? So the first one we saw was my name in double quotes. Double quotes indicates a string value. On the next one, we've got my number, and it's got 6, which has no quotes. It's just a whole number as it is. The next one is pi, which has a decimal in there, which indicates that it can hold partial values that it couldn't. And then we've got dates, which is in single quotes rather than double quotes. And the last one is going to be a true or false binary. So it has to be true in lowercase letters or false in lowercase letters. Obviously, the session's great, so it's going to be true. Here, we've got my favorite number, 6, right? So I can write the number 6 in 3 different ways. And this is just, again, to show the different data types that that variable is going to hold. 6 in double quotes means it's a string. 6 as a single number means it's a number or an integer. And then 6.0 means it can hold a partial value. So there's a couple of rules, and I'm not going to really read through these, but just stuff you know, and slides will get shared with you. But main things are, I guess maybe I will read through them. Variable names cannot have spaces. You can't have special characters like a asterisk or a hyphen or something like that in a variable name, except for an underscore. They can't start with a number. Everything has to end with a semicolon to indicate that it's been completed. And the last part is data types are defined based on how they're written, like here with the quotes or the period in between. All right, now the hardest part of today, math operators, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. You can mix and match data types, but the final result is going to match the data type it's almost always going to go the decimal route because that's the safest route. It can hold partials and whole numbers, versus a number can only hold whole numbers, right? So it's going to default to that. So when we do y times z up here, 3.0 times 10, we'll do 30.0 as the output because that's the end result. So you can mix and match these to some extent, but you can't sit there and multiply 3 times my name, right? That's not going to work. We can do additions of strings. However, it's kind of like what you probably are used to in Excel if you've ever merged first and last name or columns in an Excel sheet, and you do like A1 plus B1, you realize it shows up like this, right? Hello world with no space in between, because those two words are just stuck right next to each other. So if you want to add a space in between, you got to do something like this, where you make 3 variables, x, y, and z, and you can have a space in between. Can anyone spot the mistake on this slide? X, Y, Z. It should be X, Z, Y, right? Because Z is the space in between. All right, so keeping going. This one's going to be relational, and I think most people kind of have this down, but we'll see. So basically, if something is less than or greater than something, it's just a comparison, and the output is going to be either true or false, right? Something is always greater than or equal to something, depending on those 2 values. So we'll go through a couple more examples here. We'll do the same numbers again. Here, we've got something similar where now instead of comparing numbers, we're comparing strings. So we have hello and hello, one with caps, one without, and we're just going to ask if they're the same or not. And obviously, it looks the same, but they're not because they have different values in there. They're not an exact replica of each other. So if you try to compare one string to another, it's an exact match only, no partial matches. If you want to do a partial match, I'll show you how to do that in a little bit later. The last or second to last one almost is going to be logicals. So when you have relational operators like less than or greater than, sometimes you kind of want to daisy chain them or add multiple criteria to see if something's going to be true or not. So if you use 2 straight up pipes, that means an or statement. And if you use 2 ampersands, it means an and statement. So here, what we're going to do is, it's a little bit harder to read through. So x is greater than y. We know that x is 5 and y is 10. So this part is false here, right? And then x is greater than z. That part is true, right? Right? So you have false and true. It's false. Like there's no. So in the second example, x is greater than y. That's false, right? The first half. And x is greater than z. That's true. But because one or the other can be true, the final answer is going to be true. The last one is where it gets a little trickier. And it's going to be x is less than y, which is true, right? 5 is less than 10. And y is greater than z times z, which is 3 times 3, 9, right? And y is greater than that. So of course it's true. So we can have multiplications and other mathematical attributes and previous things we've learned so far be included in these logical operators. So we're all pretty good so far? The last one is going to be conditionals, right? So conditional is basically just checking if something is true based on the logical operators we just learned about, and then doing something based on it being true, or not doing something on it based on if it's false. So just an example of this, I'll give you a little screenshot of a script snippet. So I set a value for my grade being 98, and here if we can say that if my grade is greater than or equal to 95, get high 5 is going to be set as true, and else it's going to be set as false, right? So it's pretty simple. Any number I set for my grade at top, it'll go through this logic check, and either I'll get a high 5 or I won't get a high 5. Simple and straightforward. All right, the next one, a little bit more complicated, but still same concept. So here, instead of just doing one or the other condition, I've now got a second if-else statement on line 7 here. And so what this one is the grade is 98, and here it's going to say if my grade is in between 90 and 95, you can see I mix and match the less than and less than or equal to. If it's in between there, I'll get a high 5, but I won't get pizza. I'll only get pizza and a high 5 if it's over 95, right? And then at the bottom, they're both false. All right, so we went through pretty much everything here. Naming of variables, data types, writing syntax, math, relational, and logical operators, and then conditionals, which kind of brings it all together. So those are kind of just like the product agnostic features of Deluge, right? It's just basic scripting. You got to know these like kind of main concepts, whether it's in Creator or Deluge, whether it's in another programming language. These are generally the first things you learn about as you're picking it up. So now when we come into like the Deluge concept inside the Zoho universe, we've got to switch up kind of how we interact with it and how we know when we can use it and how it can be used. So there's two main parts to a Deluge function. One is going to be when it can be triggered, and the second one is going to be the actions that can be accomplished based on that workflow being triggered. And so focusing on triggers first, this is going to be the full map of triggers for the Creator world. And Creator has the most triggers out of all the products just because Deluge is extremely tight with Creator since it came out of it before it started being shared by other services. But here you can see every single time you're interacting with, and here is either a form record. So if you load a form, you enter something in an individual field, you click on submit, which is before it actually gets saved to the database, it still checks the validity. And then finally, when something is actually saved at that point. And then the same triggers can happen when you're editing a record versus adding a record for the first time. And the same things can happen when you're deleting a record. The difference here is mainly going to be that in Creator, you get pretty much the first 3 columns where you can trigger a function when something is loading or filling out a field or clicking submit. In most other Zoho products, it generally happens only in that last stage, which is going to be a save of a record, and then it's going to allow that custom function to get triggered. So for those of you familiar with probably CRM custom functions, the most common one, whenever you update a record or save a record, it can trigger a custom function, or whenever you create a record. So those are going to be the triggers that set it off, and then the script is whatever you write it. So those are just the only ways it can get done. Only in the Creator world are you able to do more of these triggers on the left-hand side. So it's good to know kind of what trigger points would be, because that's going to be how you can formulate your logic. So the next part is going to be actually building an action. So I talked a little bit about functions, and functions are basically, you put something into it, it's going to have a little box that does some calculation, some logic check, some work is done inside the box, and then it spits out an output. So going back to our grade school days, everybody remember how to map a parabola? Yeah, parabola. X squared, right? You have a little x and y table, you plug numbers of x in, and you put it in the formula, and then you get the function and y. Everyone remember this? But basically, it's the same concept applies. You have some information that goes in to this formula, like here the value of x. We square it, and we get the value of y on the left-hand side. And this formula could be lengthy or short, doesn't matter, but it's just we put in some value, we run that formula, and then we get an output based on that's relative to each other, right? So what we've got in Creator or in Deluge in general is we have 2 types of functions. One are going to be pre-built functions, and one are going to be custom functions that we're writing ourselves. So first I'm going to run through pre-built functions. And these are a little bit tricky because sometimes you have no idea how they work. They seem like black magic, but you just got to know that you put something into it and you formulate it the right way, and it's going to spit the information out properly for you. And so these built-in functions are all based on different data types. So just to reiterate, you have the data types of string, integer, decimal, date, and decision or Boolean. And so this is a list of all the functions, so you can read these very carefully and understand how to use them. But since that's not very practical, I'm just going to go ahead and click on this little link. It's going to open up a different website, which is in there, no pictures needed. And basically, every single function you can do in Creator or in Deluge scripts is going to be listed out here. And every single one of them is super interactive. So let's take a normal number one, for example, and let's do, no, numbers are complicated. Let's do dates, because we were talking about dates earlier. So let's say we have a date and we want to add a couple days to it. There's a function for add day. So here I've got an explanation on the left-hand side, And so here you can see that on the second line of text, it says date dot add day, and then it says number in parentheses, and then a semicolon to end that statement. So it even gives you an example and says, look, given this date in single quote format, which is what we know dates are written as, let's add 15 days to it, and it's going to go ahead and spit out a date that's 15 years later. So I'm going to come over here and zoom out, and on the right-hand side, we can see here that we have January 1, 1990, and let's add maybe 365 days to that, and I'm going to zoom out and click play. And here it's going to tell me that it was January 1991, right? Not really sure how it did it, but somehow it just took a date, added 365 days to it. So the second part of functions, which we can kind of see here, is in the function we had basically some input that's going in here, and then some value it's manipulating. So what we can do is we can actually make our own functions. We can make our own functions, and there's four main components of it. Name, the values you're going to input, the math you're going to do or the calculation, and then how we're going to spit that data out at the very end. So let me give you an example of how it's kind of written, and then I'll go through and build one out in here in Creator. So we're going to have the first thing called a return type, and a return type is going to be basically the data type that we want to send back after the calculation is over. And I'll show you two examples of that here. Then we give it a name naturally, and then we have some inputs that may or may not be required, and then we do some calculation in the middle. So as far as return types, again, all the ones that we know are numbers, are whole numbers. Float is going to be basically our decimals. Why it's called float, I don't know. Some guy in programming thought of that a while ago. Strings are our text. Booleans are our decisions. Dates are obviously our dates. There's two new data types at the bottom. I'm not going to cover quite yet. And the last one at the very top is going to be called void. And void just means it's not going to return anything. It's going to do some calculation, but that's the end of it, no more, right? So jumping through, we're going to do two function examples here, and then I'll build one out in the product. So first is we're going to make a little function that displays a name. So here you can see the very first thing, the return type, was listed as string because I'm going to return some text. And then there's two inputs that go into this function. One is going to be the first name, and one is going to be the last name, right? Those would probably be two fields of information in some form, maybe two fields of information in some spreadsheet, wherever it's coming from. So all I'm simply doing is saying a new variable I'm defining called name. We're going to take first name, we're going to add a space, and then we're going to add the last name together. And then I'm going to return the newly created variable and its value back to wherever this function was called from. So here, this time again, there's an error. Hopefully you catch it. And it's going to have the area of a circle calculation. And all we need to do to calculate the area of a circle is know its radius. So that's going to be the only argument or value that goes into this function. Then I take 3.14, which is just a rounded pi number. I could do a proper if I wanted to. And I'm going to multiply it by the radius twice. I could probably do a built-in function and use an exponent instead. But here I kept it simple so you can read it. So radius times 3.14 equals the area. And then it's going to return the area. Can anyone spot the issue here? String, right? It should definitely have been a float because 9 out of 10 times the area is always some oddly long decimal that's never, evenly done just because of the way pi works. But yeah, some information goes in, just the radius, and we spit out an area based on the calculation that happened with the data that was input into it. And so I'll come back over here and show you. If you didn't notice already, what I did was when I came into Creator and went into Settings, I can make functions directly from here. So I've got one that I had just made called my name. And if I zoom in, you can see here that by default, I've got this void function. And that basically means nothing's going to get displayed or returned back when this function is called. However, we saw the info statement be printed. So info is only for debugging. It's just going to show a value or a calculation that we want it to. So here, it's going to show x divided by y. If I delete this and I say zoho.current time, it's going to show me that instead. Even though it's not related to anything about the numbers I defined or anything else with this function, I execute it, and bam, it's going to give me back today's current time, right? And so info is how we can display or understand what the value of a variable is while we're writing a script here. We can add other pieces of information as the arguments directly up here in those parentheses like we had in the example. So here, let me add maybe a radius. So I'll add integer radius, and then I'll say x equals the radius, y equals 10, and we'll info x times y, right? So this is just going to take some I named it radius, but it doesn't have to be called radius. It could be called, this if we wanted it to be. We'll just leave it like this. So we're going to take that variable that's defined as the input, multiply it by 10, and info it. So I'm going to save the function real quick and execute it. And now this time it's going to ask me for some input. And so I have to enter that input argument. So let's just put 10 to be simple. And so 10 times 10 should be 100. 10 times 10 should be 100. And so that log message gets displayed that way. And so if I didn't do a void, maybe I want to do a float here instead. Instead of this info, I would need to return it, because instead of just being a debugging display of information, I actually need to send this information back to wherever this function was called from. So here I'm going to return it, and I'm going to return, let's say, 10 times whatever this variable is. And I'm going to save the function, I'm going to execute it, and again, this time I'll do 5. Everybody knows what 5 times 10 is, right? All right, so 50, right? So same concept applies. It looks kind of similar in that output message, but the idea of returning a value back to where this function was called from is different than the info statement, which is just a kind of helpful internal debugging mechanism. So here I've got another example, a couple of different variables that I've defined here, or a couple of different info statements I've got written out here, and we can combine them. We can use system variables in an info statement. We can use static variables we set. We can use strings. We can use combinations of the two and do a calculation. It doesn't really matter. The info will show whatever the final output is of that line statement. Now we get to something tricky. We've got something called record IDs. And when we have information that exists in a database somewhere, let's say our CRM or accounting or wherever, let's say we have 2 customers who happen to have the exact same name and happen to have the exact same birthday. That's not my birthday. I'm not that old. But 2 names, 2 same birthdays, but 2 maybe different unique identifying numbers. So anytime information is added to an application in the Zoho ecosystem, it's always going to have a unique ID associated with it. And that unique ID is generated automatically on our end, and that's how we can actually pick and choose pieces of information. So even though when you're looking at a list report that shows first name, last name, email address, stuff like that, there's always a hidden field, or sometimes not hidden if you chose to display it, of a record ID. And that's going to be how we know exactly which record it is that we want to go for. Because on this page, if we did a search for maybe, well, none of them are the same here, but if we did a search for records that start with the name John, or all the John Smiths, if there's 4 John Smiths in my system, I don't get the right one, and so I have to refer to it by a unique identifier, right? Consider it to be like a social security number, essentially, might even honestly be more private than yours. Keeping on going is, now that we can identify the specific record, we have to be able to do work on that record. So going back to those functions and how custom functions and Deluge work in Zoho applications, generally we're manipulating data across different products. So these are what's called CRUD operations. And CRUD just basically stands for create, read, update, and delete. Generally, we have some information going into this function. We're going to do some calculation, and then we're going to either do one of these 4 actions at the very end. So a good example, and probably a popular CRM example, is let's say I've got 40 deals in my CRM that have either closed or lost or whatever, all with the same contact. And at the end of the day, I want to know how much business has this contact actually given me. I would want to run a function where it basically goes through every single deal that's been won by a certain contact, add up those values, and then save it in some value. So that would be an update of a record. We're updating the contact with a new value. That would be the end result. Or I have some information that happens in my CRM, I do some math and reorganize the information, and then finally I want to create a record in analytics over here in my reporting tool and immediately have that sync happen. So different actions can happen, but there's ways to kind of relate to it. I mean, everybody should get this. Creating a record is just like filling out a form. Reading a record is kind of like searching and looking at a report or a list view. Updating a record is like clicking the edit button, and deleting a record is like deleting a record. So going into actually how these integration tasks kind of look, it's pretty similar to the built-in functions that we have, except they all start with the Zoho period, just because that's how we're easily able to identify them. And then it's Zoho.serviceName dot action, and then whatever parameters we need to put into this function. So it's all function-based, same concepts, and there's a variable on the left that's going to be where we store the information that's collected. So here's a couple examples on the CRM side. You can see I've kind of color-coded it so it's a little bit easier to read, hopefully. But these are all our CRM actions, or some of the CRM actions. And here you can see that the very first one says create. And inside create, there's 2 parameters that are going into this function. The first is a module, so which table or which module in the CRM is it creating in? Are we creating a lead? Are we creating an account? Are we creating a contact, an opportunity, or a custom module record? Doesn't matter. And then the values. And the values are going to be all the information we need to send in order to create that record remotely, right? What values do you think we need to send in order to create a record remotely? That's where our new data type here called maps comes in. And so maps is going to be basically a way to hold multiple pieces of information in a single variable. And so here I've got 3 pieces of information: a source, an email, and a phone. I probably should have had a name in there. I don't know what kind of contact gets created without a name, but it's okay. As long as you got their email, that's good with me. And what you can see here is I've defined a map up top, and I've never had to do this before. With any of the examples before, if I want to define a variable, I never had to do equals map and like define it. In some programming languages, if you're used to it, you might have to define a variable or initiate a variable in the very beginning. In Creator and Deluge, you don't have to do that. Except for this map, it's just a little bit easier to read. I did it this way. You can manually do it in a long form writing, but it's just more annoying. So I created this variable at the top called values, and then I added or put 3 things in there: a source, and creator, an email, and the login user ID, and the phone number. So this is one variable values map that holds 6 technically unique pieces of information. And so if you look at the first part of this map, it's going to say source, email, and phone. These are obviously something like a field name, right? Or the unique identifier field, or key is what it's called actually here, that information is going to. And on the right-hand side, creator, login, user ID, and 512, whatever, is all going to be the values. So naturally, when I went to go send this information to my CRM service, in the next slide, all I have to do, oh, now I've got names, okay. I'm going to send it to the contacts module, and I'm going to use this values map that I've mapped out. And so now it knows that when I'm creating a contact in CRM, we're going to take the first name value, put it in there, take the last name value, put it in there, find the email value, put it in there. And it's all going to happen basically in 5 lines of code, give or take. We've basically got data going from creator to CRM bare bone. Now, I wouldn't really suggest someone to just write a function that literally just does this. You can easily use the flow tool I was talking about in the morning with more point and click configuration. But ideally, maybe in our creator application that's collecting information, we have maybe some hidden fields that the customer doesn't see. Or maybe we're doing some math and we're taking their email address, we're looking it up in some third-party directory service, and we're finding out, what's the size of the company, and we're taking all that new information, and then we're finally sending it off to CRM. Here, it's just 4 pieces of information, filling out a form, and getting booted straight to CRM. There's less code-intensive ways to do it, but just to show you that with the code, it's pretty short and pretty simple. Next one I'm going to show you is a little bit weirder. So the first one was creating. Creating is easy. You send information to a service, you hope you sent it all in the same format that it was expecting to accept it in, and it'll take it. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm searching for a contact based on an email address that I input into this function. So you can see void is the return type, which means there's no return. I just need the info statement here. And the argument going into it is going to be the email address. And then I'm searching my contacts module of the CRM and based on an email address. So I type in this weird email address, chrismarrier@gmail.com, and what my output looks like is this. This is a hot mess to deal with, right? But if we look a little bit closely inside this hot mess, we've got information like mailing zip and then a value. All of it's enclosed in quotes. And so that's basically our key value pair that's coming back, our field name and our field value. And so once we've got all this information here, I can start plucking it all out, right? If I want to pluck information out of here, there's a couple functions I can use to do that. But one thing that's going to be tricky here that you're not going to be able to know off the bat is when you do a search, which is what I'm doing up here, we're searching based on an email address. And here, if I show you, if I try to use this get function, which is how we actually pull information out, and I try to get the contact ID listed, it's not going to let me. Can anyone tell me why if I search for something based on an email address and try to get something out of that result, it doesn't give me anything? Multiple records, yeah. Multiple records is exactly right. So based on that email address, when we're doing a search, we don't exactly know how many return results we're going to get. It could be 0, it could be 100, it could be 1,000,000, it could be 1, right? And so we would actually need to be able to pluck the first result or be able to find which result it was that I'm actually looking for out of all the results that were returned to me. So a lazy way of doing it is this version I've got here on line 5. And again, slide sent to you, don't worry about taking pictures, just understand the concept. I've got this get 0. And get 0 really just gets me the first search result that was returned. Now, a lazy person will just trust that the first search result is the right one and click on it and go with it. Otherwise, you might need to be able to do more information and go through all the search results. And so in order to go through all the search results, we got to do something called looping. And looping is going to be how we can naturally go through every item in a list. So here's an example I've got for you. I made a quick little list, and I called it Tejas, John, and Billy. And you can see that the capitalizations of each one of these names is a little bit different, right? Proper case, lowercase, and then weird case. And then I established a new list that I'm going to populate on line 4. And then I did what's called a loop, which is going to be for each speaker in the speaker list. And speaker, the word speaker here, is going to be kind of like a temporary variable for how I identify each item in this list, right? So Tejas is a speaker the first time the circle goes through, then John is the speaker the second time the circle goes through, then Billy, third time it goes through. Every single time inside that loop, I'm going to convert the speaker's name into proper case, which means capital first letter, lowercase everything else. And then I'm going to add it to the new list I established on line 4. And then at the very end on line 9, I'm going to print out the results. So at the very bottom here, you can see that it shows, it's going to show my name, John's name, and Billy's name in proper casing rather than weird letters that was in before, because I looped through all those results. At the end of all this, I've got maybe a couple minutes for a few examples if you want to throw some hard ones at me. But otherwise, we went through pre-built functions, which is going to be Deluge's native ways of manipulating data so you don't have to. Things like rounding things, uppercase, lowercasing items, sine, cosine calculations, adding days, adding years, all pre-built items that are automatic functions available for you that are all data manipulation based. Then we went into custom functions where we can build our own function, have our input, have our return type, do some calculation and return an output, be able to use the info statement for debugging, reading, updating information and how that kind of works in the process, identifying records based on their IDs, and then looping. Now you can code. Best part of this whole presentation.